Pascal's wager. It's a hell of a bet, but the main place that is wagered for in Pascal's wager is heaven, a place of infinite bliss. But the bet is too simple, in my opinion. If you're going to be gambling for heaven, really, you should be gambling using a paradise. Now, I haven't made a video on this in the past because I found Pascal's wager to be something that isn't seriously used in the context of debate or attempts at conversion, that kind of thing. But atheist YouTuber Paulogia reached out to me with a clip of William Lane Craig discussing Pascal's wager, and, well, it turns out there is some conversation around it that is relevant to polytheism. So, let's take a look at Pascal's wager. It's best represented as a graph, looking at the ontological propositions that God exists or that God does not exist, and then comparing that with the position that you have believed or not believed. We then see the results in the form of four possibilities. If God does not exist and you did believe, well, maybe you wasted some of your time and effort. If you did not believe, then maybe you spent some of your time usefully. If God does exist, however, and you did believe, then you receive eternal salvation. If you did not believe, then you receive eternal damnation. Now, on its face, Pascal's wager doesn't really achieve that much. What it tries to show is that if you look at belief as a wager, then rationality ought lead you to believe. We see that due to what's on the table, the possibility of infinite reward, additionally contrasted with the possibility of infinite damnation, a rational person would make the bet of infinite reward. Infinite reward is, quite obviously, infinitely more rewarding than infinite damnation. It's also infinitely more rewarding than the finite results of death in the case that God does not exist. Another formulation of the wager recognizes that if God is merciful, then infinite damnation should not be considered as on the table. So the wager is amended to being four options, one infinite and the other three different values of finite. The result of the logical analysis is the same, that one should take the wager of infinite reward regardless of the finite values of the other choices, because there is no finite value that can bring reward comparable to an infinite reward. So if there is even a small chance of an infinite reward, a rational person would take that wager. Now, there's two major points against Pascal's wager that make me just dismiss it out of hand, both of which have been made against the wager over the course of history. One is that the wager itself doesn't really raise the likelihood of the existence of God. So if you're wanting to convince somebody with this, you're not convincing them with an argument that is meant to bring them closer to the truth. You're just appealing to their interests of self-preservation and reward. The other is the idea that believing on the basis of the wager has some moral issues, and that a God who is offering eternal reward might see through belief that is based simply on the idea of wanting access to eternal or infinite reward as a point of making a bet. An all-knowing God, like in the case of Christianity, would certainly know whether or not your belief is genuine, and perhaps he is only looking for genuine believers rather than those who are just gaming the system by gambling for the best result. Congratulations, you have believed in the right thing. Here is infinite bliss and a free kitten. But these things kind of misrepresent the wager for what it seems to have been intended to do. To steelman the wager, what it wants to say is, yo, this is the position with the preferable result. Maybe you should re-examine your life, sin less, and explore Christianity. People join and leave religions for bad reasons all the time, and then find their footing somewhere along their journey. Someone might convert to Christianity for a bad reason, and they become a good Christian with a better foundation in the process of their journey exploring. The same could be said of an atheist, a pagan, whatever. But let's be honest, this isn't usually how Pascal's wager is typically used. Rarely do non-Christians become Christians because of something like Pascal's wager. But sometimes someone might stay in Christianity because of reasoning very similar to it. Personally, I found the act of leaving Christianity to be, to an extent, the act of making the wager that hell does not exist. I think this is probably fairly common, and I've heard the same in conversations with atheists who may regularly talk about how they have had, or even still have, a fear of hell for months or even years after their journey out of Christianity. For me, there was significant time processing that, but one of the things that helped out, given that my journey was toward polytheism, was the many gods objection to Pascal's wager. To be clear, I think that the many gods objection, as typically presented, is a bad objection, but it's not a bad objection inherently, and I'll explain why. Sometimes it's just presented as the idea that there's a bunch of other gods that do the same thing as the Christian God and have their own heaven and, their own hell or whatever. But that's not what we find when we look at the religions of the world. In fact, it seems that Christianity, with its heaven and hell, is a bit weird when it comes to religion broadly. There are similar afterlives in popular understandings of a few other religions, such as Islam, for example, and some of these religions have broad international cultural influence. Again, Islam comes to mind. However, if you look at the sheer number of religions, the conception of hell, especially an eternal hell, is quite rare. Access to heaven by the acceptance of the salvation of a Christ figure seems to be an aspect of Christianity that sets it apart from most religions as well. Islam, for example, doesn't have this aspect. There is a heaven, but the way to get there is quite different. So let's go over some things that William Lane Craig, a famous Christian philosopher, said about the many gods objection. Atheist YouTuber Paulogia reached out to me with a clip of him discussing it, and he asked me for a short response. Let's take a look at it here.
Well, it's the famous many gods objection, and that is the most important objection. Different religions can all say the same thing. But there are two responses that the Pascalian can make to that. One is that if these other alternatives have sufficiently low probability, they can be safely ignored. For example, the probability that Odin or Zeus.
Did you say Zeus?
Yeah, Zeus.
Like the Zeus. Zeus.
I'm not sure if he has a second name.
Is really the true God is so negligible that it can be left aside.
That's outside my lane. Ocean?
This is an interesting take from Craig. There's a book, actually, that's published by Harvard called 1,000,001 Gods that discusses this weird dismissal of polytheism in academia and how unfounded it is. And this seems to be just another example of that because Craig's statement seems just completely unsubstantiated. Polytheism has a few advantages with respect to likelihood over monotheism. Polytheism explains the diversity of religious experience. Monotheism has problems with this. Polytheism has greater correlation to the world we experience and more easily addresses things like the problem of evil. Polytheism is able to engage with many of the same arguments that monotheism proposes as arguments for itself, such as the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, while not having these pitfalls that come with the description of the Christian God, such as the coherency of omnipotence or the wild mess that is the Trinity. So typically the objection that's put forward by Christians against polytheism is that polytheism is made up of so many other religions that conflict with one another, and that's what lowers the likelihood. But this winds up strawmanning polytheism as it's expressed in history, which typically saw the multiplicity of traditions as a reflection of the reality of polytheism, not something to be seen as in conflict with it. But I guess the real issue with this statement would be that no one who believes in the existence of Zeus or Odin is proposing that they are the one true God. They are proposing multiple gods, as they are deities that come from polytheist traditions. So his statement is false because it's predicated on a gross misconception and is simply malformed. And really, he should know better. A link to Paulogia's comprehensive breakdown of some of William Lane Craig's recent statements can be found in the description below. I'll also link a few videos that expand on those points. The many gods objection to Pascal's wager is stronger than a lot of people think it is. Typically, it's represented as just expanding the wager into multiple wagers of the same form, in which one is betting in an environment of many gods who will each, in theory, send you to their own version of hell if you don't believe in the right one, or maybe just several options to get into a version of heaven. But polytheism in practice and in history views this issue a little differently. Just as polytheists propose multiple gods, we would propose multiple afterlives, because really, if there's one afterlife, what's to stop there from being more? And even Christianity has 2, sometimes 3 versions of the afterlife, so this isn't really a strange proposition. This realization is something that helped me in finally processing through the image of hell that had been thrown at me during my time as a Christian. The many gods objection, when looked at in the context of a polytheist framework, significantly undermines Pascal's wager as something completely unnecessary. These various traditions seem to acknowledge the afterlife on one level or another, and if there is a punishment afterlife, it doesn't seem to necessarily have to do with whether or not you believed in the right deity or deities. Now, in a world in which there are many gods, and in addition, many afterlives, what would this mean for atheists? And the truth is, I don't really know. I can imagine a world in which the journey to the afterlife is something universal, something that would include atheists. And I can imagine a world in which you may get the afterlife in which you've invested based on the relationships that you foster with the gods. I can also imagine that some of those who don't believe in an afterlife just have no interest in the afterlife. They may hold that eternity, especially one of unchanging bliss, whatever it might hold, would be a punishment, making this life that they experience all the more beautiful for its temporality. And to be honest, I find this position hard to disagree with. Part of what makes life interesting is the challenges, learning about the world around us, and honestly, sometimes just seeing what happens. An unending, unchanging afterlife of bliss would be devoid of the things that make life interesting. Hello, and welcome to your daily Heaven News Bulletin. Today is the same as yesterday, which was the same as the day before, which was the same as everyone is happy and nothing is wrong, which has been the case going back as long as anybody around here can remember. And to be honest, I'm getting a little bored. What's going on in hell? But with an afterlife in mind, Christianity's salvation narrative comes off as a little absurd in light of a polytheist theology. Christians may go to their heaven and others may go to their afterlives. Maybe there's a land of the dead in which there are many halls, with people of different faiths able to greet one another and celebrate with their ancestors. And in this land, one such hall is heaven, within which no one is allowed to leave. But there seems to be a lot of singing emanating from within its cryptic walls. Now, I've said in another video dealing with Valhalla as the Viking heaven that my perspective on the afterlife is that if it exists, I'll be happily surprised when I find it. If it does not exist, well, then, I won't exist to be upset. I learned recently that this perspective was shared by the ancient Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero. In his text On Old Age, Cicero summed up the prospect of the afterlife as either being happily surprised by it, or not unhappy that it's not there because he wouldn't be able to experience the lack of an afterlife. And I've never seen that perspective written anywhere else, but hey, some ancient Roman had the same thought. But looking back at Pascal's wager, heaven being a state of infinite reward is questionable, as heaven is an afterlife that may be a haunting world for some. The many gods objection provides an opportunity for a multiplicity of afterlives to be discussed, each of which are rewards to be evaluated on their own basis. A rational mind may not desire an infinite reward, as the description of that reward isn't a reward to that individual. Finite rewards may be preferable. No afterlife may be preferable. I think that a major folly of Pascal's wager is that it pretends that all humans are the same and have the same desires. Let me know where y'all are at on this, but from where I'm at, the many gods objection, when fleshed out with a polytheist and pluralist view of the afterlife, accounts for the diversity of human desires and renders the wager itself to be entirely irrelevant. There's no reason to advocate for the wager on any premise. The prospect of infinite reward may not be desired. Belief in a particular god may be irrelevant to whatever preferred reward one might have. And perhaps afterlives of interest to one's desires can be fostered through the praxis with any deity associated with a desired afterlife. And hey, if none of this is true, then there's no unhappiness to be experienced. So, in my opinion, if one is a polytheist, Pascal's wager is worthless. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. The like button and subscribe button have become gambling streamers and are in dire straits at the moment, so give them a click, it'll help the channel, and it'll make them feel better. And ring the bell if you want to be kept posted for more heathen content. And remember to find a way or make one. Just a word of caution, do not advocate for Pascal's wager on Twitch. They will likely permaban you.